Hi, I'm Reverend Wendy Craig-Purcell here at the Unity Center in San Diego. Thank you so much for watching today. If you'd like to support the work that we do here, please consider making a contribution. Go to our website. It's easy to do. Thank you in advance for that contribution.
So there was a man who needed a job, and he found one, and it was to be working at a zoo. The pay was great, but it was kind of a strange job. You see, their gorilla had escaped, and they needed to have this man dress up in a gorilla costume and try to convince the visitors that he was the real thing. Well, because the pay was good, he decided, okay, he dons his gorilla costume and he's in his area, his pet, and he's doing his thing and he's really getting into it. He's just pounding on his chest and he's swinging and he's just really convincing and people are really liking it. Well, he gets so carried away that he swings over into the lion exhibit. And all of a sudden he forgets, he's sworn to confidentiality, he forgets because he remembers he's not a lion, he's a man, and he starts screaming for help. The lion pounces on him and says, "Shh, you want to get us both fired?" What I like about that is that it reminds me the tendency we have to put on masks in order to feel safe. And that when we put on a mask, it might seem to work for a little while and we get to kind of pretend, but eventually we're going to find ourselves in a place where it's not working for us anymore. We've got to become real. We've got to let the world see us, hear us, know us. Will everybody love us? No. But we can be sure then that those who do connect with us, those who do stay with us, they're staying with the real us. They're staying with the real version of ourselves. And so to me, what I want to talk to you about this morning is this idea of belonging, this idea that there is a time and a place and a season for everything, just like the song we heard. To everything there is a season. To everything there is a purpose. A time to plant, a time to harvest. A time for laughter, a time of crying. A time to be born, a time to die. That song, the scripture, is about the ebb and the flow of life, and that all of life is forever in this cycle of ebbing and flowing. Of ebbing and flowing. And what is true and powerful about that scripture verse is that at the end of it, as it has painted all of these contrasts between the idea of planting and then harvesting, of being born and then dying, of peace and war, or war and peace, at the end of that beautiful passage in scripture are the words, God has made everything beautiful in its time. God has made everything beautiful in its time. As is true in so many verses of the Bible like this, we hold on to the front end of it, the promise. God has made everything beautiful. Yes, 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 we say to that. But we kind of forget. There's a little disclaimer, or maybe it's not a disclaimer as much as a caveat, an explanation. In its time. And so we must hold on to both. We must hold on as we are navigating our lives, whether it's through this pandemic or through the changes brought about as a result of the pandemic, changes in our lifestyle, changes in our work and our family dynamics and our social life. We must hold on to both of these. That God has made everything, including this, beautiful in its own time, in its own time. What I want to encourage you to hold on to is this idea of beholding beauty, beholding beauty. I think it's helpful from time to time to go back and look at the dictionary definition of words that we use easily and frequently, just to remind us of what they really mean. And so here is how the dictionary defines beauty: the quality that is present in a thing or a person giving intense pleasure or deep satisfaction to the mind. It arises from sensory manifestations such as shape, color, sound, from a meaningful design or pattern, or from something else, such as a personality in which high spiritual qualities exist. So it's this idea of that which is pleasant, that which is uplifting, that which is pleasing to the eye, to the ear, to the mind, to the heart, to the soul. What would it be like if we took on as a spiritual practice, as the writer of Ecclesiastes, I think, is suggesting, that we recognize the ebb and flow of life, and in the midst of the ebb and flow, we don't get lost, we behold that everything is beautiful in its own time. I've always loved the story of the abbot in the monastery. There was a time that the monastery was doing very well, and monks flocked to it and wanted to learn and to live the monastic life. And then, for reasons long since forgotten, people started to disperse, and the monastery was hitting upon bad times. There were no new people coming in. And the abbot of the monastery was very worried about that. He thought, what am I going to do? There's no new people coming in. There are no new monks. And so the abbot was friends with the rabbi. And he went to his friend the rabbi and talked to him about his aching heart for the fact that his monastery was failing. And the rabbi listened intently and then said to the abbot, well, you know, one of the remaining monks in your monastery is actually the Messiah. The abbot was quite taken back by that because, of course, this was not a synagogue, it was a monastery. But he said, well, okay, you really think that one of them is the Messiah? Rabbi said, yes. And the rabbi said to him, and so you must go back and you must tell all of the monks that one of them, but we don't know who, one of them is the Messiah. So the abbot went back to the monastery. And he thought to himself, well, could it be me? Could it be Brother John? Could it be Brother Timothy? Who is it? And so he gathered the remaining monks and he told them, the rabbi said, one of us here is the Messiah. And with that, the monks started to treat one another very differently. They started to treat their work in the monastery differently. They looked at each other differently. The abbot looked at them differently. And suddenly there was this energy that was building in the monastery, that this magnetic energy that was bringing in new people who wanted to study, who wanted to live this life, and it began to flourish again. And of course, we know that what this is pointing us to is the important truth that how we behold one another makes all the difference in the world in terms of how we treat one another. Think about the much-loved children's story of Beauty and the Beast, right? The arrogant young prince and his castle servants fall under a spell because the prince has to learn how to love and to be loved. And the beautiful young girl, Belle, her father is taken captive in the castle, and she wants to go and rescue him. And the whole plot of the story is about how the prince turned into this ugly beast. The only way he's going to be transformed is if he learns how to love and to be loved. And of course, Belle looks at him and there's nothing that she finds attractive, right? But through their getting to know one another, she begins to behold him in a different way. He begins to behold himself in a different way. It's all in the beholding, is it not? God has made everything beautiful in its own time. Now, I'm not going to pretend. There are some people and some times and some situations where it's a whole lot easier to hold on to and say, yes, I know that God has made this person beautiful in his or her own time, but I'm sure that there are some people that might come to your mind right now that you think, how in the world could I ever hold that for that person? But it doesn't change the fact. It does not change the fact, it does not change the truth, that in the act of beholding, we begin to help another transform. I've always loved these words of Goethe's. Treat a man as he is, and he will remain so. Treat a man as he is, and he will remain so. Treat a man the way he can be and ought to be, and he will become as he can be and should be. That's what the abbot and the monks were doing to each other when they believed that one of them was the Messiah. That's what happened when Bel started to behold the beast in a different way. It's exactly the same thing that Jesus did again and again when you think about the people that he associated with. Remember the story of the scribes and the Pharisees trying to trick him with his knowledge of the Mosaic law? And so they had found a woman caught in the act of adultery, and in the gospel it says in the very act, and I always wonder if it was in the very act, where is the guy? But that's a whole other story. So they bring the woman caught in adultery to Jesus, the scribes and the Pharisees, trying to trick him in his ignorance of the Mosaic law, because the Mosaic law was very clear that the punishment for adultery was to be publicly stoned to death. And so they asked Jesus, what are we to do with her? And he remained silent. There are times that being silent is really powerful. He remained silent. And they asked again. And when he finally spoke, he said, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. The crowd disappeared. And only left was Jesus and the woman. He asked her, where are your accusers? She replies, they are all gone. And he says to her, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Don't keep making the same mistakes. That's all that the word sin means. I know it's a charged word. It comes out of a Greek archery term that simply means to miss the mark. And who among us has not missed the mark? It does not mean that we are flawed and inherently bad. We are not. Remember, in Unity, we do not believe that we are born in original sin. We're not born in original sin. But he says to her, go and sin no more. In other words, don't keep doing the things that are going to hurt you and to damage your life, right? He beheld her not in the way her accusers did. He beheld her despite some bad choices she may have made in her life. The monks beheld each other not just as ordinary monks, but as someone maybe extraordinary. Beauty began to behold the beast not as the beast, but as the quality of the being within that mask, within that facade. Important question I pose to you is, how are you beholding the people in your life? How are you beholding your significant other, your siblings, your children? I bet that's pretty easy to behold, if not all of the time, most of the time, as beautiful, as wonderful, as lovable. How are you beholding that neighbor you're having difficulty with? How are you beholding that coworker that's really getting under your nerves? How are you beholding those that think and vote and believe so differently than you do? How are you beholding the one who is actually acting in damaging and destructive ways? We never condone the behavior, but we can still behold that inherent within that, even within that individual, despite how they may be acting out, despite that they may be acting as if they are a gorilla when in fact they are not, that we know that within every single person is the spark of the divine, is the spark of the divine. It is important as well not only to look at how are we beholding the people in our lives. Remember, God has made all things beautiful in its own time. God has made all beings beautiful. God has made all things, the events and circumstances you find yourself in right now, there is beauty to be had in its own time in those very experiences. Everything in your life is leading to you to right where you are right now. How are you beholding where you are right now? And if where you are right now is not to your liking, what can you do to begin to change some of that while still holding to the truth that in time it can and will look different. In a much earlier version of my life, I used to be a little like a Susie homemaker. I would sew and knit and crochet and needlepoint and tat and all of these things. And I can remember making, from scratch, without a pattern, a very tiny needlepoint version of the Porsche emblem. My husband, John, I don't know if we were just dating or very early into our marriage, loved Porsches, and I thought, what a cool thing to make this for him. Tiny, tiny, tiny little, almost like Petty Point, I think it's called. And the front side of it looked beautiful, but I can remember looking at the back side of it with all of the knots and the colors crossing over, and some of the threads were metallic threads because I wanted it to look just like that emblem, and some were orange and some were black, and on the backside it looked awful. And it always looked awful on the backside. But on the front, it turned out to be beautiful. Our lives are like that sometimes. But if we could look at it from the place where God is looking at it, we would see how everything is conspiring to come together to be something beautiful. It's like the line in one of Robert Browning's poems, "On earth the broken ark, in heaven the perfect round." And I want to share with you that there's yet one more area of beholding that is so important. I've talked about beholding the other and knowing that God has made all things beautiful in its time. I talked about beholding the circumstances of our lives, not denying what the backside of the tapestry, so to speak, not denying when life is really messy, but also knowing it doesn't have to stay that way. It isn't going to stay that way, that we can co-create and change that in its own time. But beholding is also, and maybe for some of us this is the hardest area, how we behold ourselves. How we behold ourselves. And I suppose that some of how difficult that is or is not has to do with the kinds of messages that we grew up with from the influential adults in our lives. And sometimes those most influential adults are our parents. Not always. Sometimes it can be a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, or it can be anybody, right? But if we got messages of somehow we were bad or we were wrong or we were not born right the first time, whatever wounding we may have gotten, it can be really difficult to behold ourselves as beautiful. And this is where having those in our lives who genuinely love us and care about us hold up a mirror to us, and I'm talking about a figurative mirror now, where the other that loves us can say, "But I see who you really are," can help us begin to see who we really are. Remember Rudyard Kipling's story of the Jungle Book, the children's story of the little boy Mowgli, who was born in the jungle and was raised by a pack of wolves, and he grew up thinking of himself as a wolf. He was trained in the ways of the wolf, but eventually as he grew out of boyhood into young manhood, the wolves knew that they couldn't keep him in the village, that he needed to go to the man village. And so the story is how to get him to the man village. And the panther Bahir volunteers to take Mowgli to the man village because that's where he really needs to be. He really needs to be with his people. And Mowgli doesn't want to go. He doesn't want the change. He's only known the life of being raised like a wolf. And he resists every bit of the way, but eventually they get to the man village. And eventually Mowgli sees a girl for the very first time. And he kind of likes what he sees. And he wants another kind of view. And he's curious about, what is this being? And he happens to, I'm remembering the story right, comes upon some water, and he sees his reflection in the water. And in seeing his reflection in the water, he realizes, wait a minute, I'm kind of much more like this girl than I am like these wolves that I was born with. And as soon as he began to see himself as he really was, he began to act differently. Don't let those words go by too quickly. As soon as we see who we really are, we do begin to act differently. When we really see that we are not the wrinkles on our face or the extra weight we've carried or the mistakes that we have made or what society has said is possible for us, that we are not that we are something so much more than that, and that first and foremost, we are spiritual beings made in the image and after the likeness of God. When we get that, when we own that, we begin to act very differently. We make different choices. We live our lives on purpose. And we do not only live our lives for ourselves. When we really get who and what we are, compassion explodes in us. We cannot turn away from the suffering of another because we know who they are as well. And so in the beautiful words of Ecclesiastes, in the beautiful reminder that to everything there is a season, there is a purpose to everything. And no matter where we are in the cycle of the ebb and the flow of all of that God has made all things beautiful in its own time. And so I encourage you as you go about living your life this week with the people that you interact with at home, or if you're a frontline worker and you're going to work, on the freeway, great place to practice, that you behold everyone, everything, and yourself as beautiful. Namaste.